Right, so good afternoon. So I'm going to be talking to you kind of about metrics and kind of covering some of the background as to what metrics we have at our disposal and what we can do with them and what type of information they give us. And also kind of trying to pull this together in a couple of themes that I think are kind of relevant for this audience. So firstly, this kind of idea of how do metrics travel and kind of thinking about the metrics that I might want to use looking at publishing a journal based in the UK. How does this relate to a journal published in South Africa, in Tanzania, in Bangladesh? How can we utilise this and how can we understand the challenges that this represents? And also kind of a final thing as to what we're looking at in terms of the trade-off between the value of a metric and the practicality in being able to use it. The information that we want to actually look at is often the information that we can't easily retrieve in a systematic way. So, as a kind of introduction to that, I'm going to run through some of the existing metrics in kind of a broadly chronological order. So, I'm going to start off by talking about kind of citation metrics. And these are kind of the most historic metrics. They were originally the kind of only systematic way we had of looking at journal research. So, Eugene Garfield in the 1960s founded the Institute for Scientific Information. And this was the first kind of systematic multilingual, multidisciplinary database. Until that point, everything had been done quite manually, and it was manually curated, which meant that you couldn't spread across disciplines. He decided that we could use these new technology, computers, and therefore we could do things in a more systematic and multidisciplinary way. And this kind of came to a metric in the 1970s when they launched the journal citation reports and created the impact factors. These were initially a tool for librarians in order to buy journals, not to be used for research evaluation or for judging journals from an editorial perspective. Now, the impact factor, very simple, easy equation, number of citations in a given year to articles published in the preceding 2 years, or content published in the preceding 2 years, divided by the number of articles and reviews published in those 2 years. It's a very simple ratio, it's just the average number of citations that your content's receiving. I think conceptually it's very easy to understand, most people can grasp it, unlike some of the other more complicated metrics that people have created. But this simplicity creates some issues, and I just want to kind of touch on what I think are kind of three of the most major. The first one, and I think the most obvious one in some ways when you start to look at the data, is this idea of distribution of citations. So I'm going to take what I think is the most extreme example of this in recent years with a journal called Active Crystallographer Section A, which published an article called A Short History of Shellacs. The one I checked about 2 weeks ago has now been cited 32,000 times. This article was published in 2009, and the 2009 impact factor for this journal was about 2. The 2010 impact factor for this journal, so 2011 impact factor for this journal was more than 50. This one article had taken a mid-ranking crystallography journal and put it to the top of the second highest impact factor journal in the entire JCR. So one article was having a massive effect on the ranking for this journal. And the same applies for pretty much any journal. If we were to use a journal, or the journal impact factor, as a measure for academic research, we're actually not looking at the kind of indicative quality of that research, but we're being misled by the skewed distribution of citations in that research. There's a kind of differential between these two equations. At the top half, we're looking at citations to content. At the bottom half, we're only looking at number of articles and reviews. This is basically just a hangover from the fact that the JCR was built in the 1970s. Computing power was expensive. So as a shortcut, they only look for two parts of the reference. They look for the year of publication and the journal it's in. The JCR doesn't know if you're going to citing a review article or a research article, but they look at the number of articles and reviews because you don't want to kind of disadvantage a journal that's publishing 1,000 book reviews, which are almost certain to be never cited. This leads to a problem that the decision between what's an article and a review and any other content in your journal is quite subjective. So there's often a complaint that certain journals seem to get favourable treatment with Thomson Reuters in terms of which articles are being classified in the denominator and which are not. And it also means that kind of if you publish a lot of controversial editorials, for example, your impact factor improves based on these, and the other research articles in your journal are effectively unfairly being given more credit in using the impact factor as a metric. And the kind of final area from this is there's no adjustment in this calculation for the subject you're publishing in. A history journal has a median impact factor or expected impact factor of about 0.5. For cell biology, this is kind of more like 5, so an order of magnitude higher. We're not saying that cell biology research is 10 times better than history research, does have very different citation patterns, and this metric makes no adjustment for this at all. So, pretty much in the last 5 years, a variety of metrics have been created that have attempted to adjust for various different things that are wrong with the impact factor. So Thomson Reuters came up with a 5-year impact factor. Some people at the University of Washington came up with these eigenfactors and article influence scores that are basically black boxes and take the value of a citation as dependent on the journal it comes from. So a citation from Nature is worth more than a citation from the Canadian Journal of Naval Architecture. Some people in Leiden came up with the SNP, which is based on Elsevier's Scopus database, and the attempt with this is to adjust the subject, so I can then compare a history journal against a cell biology journal. And finally, some people in Spain came up with something called the Simago Journal Rank, that's based on Scopus and is basically very similar to the article influence score. So what I've done here is taken the correlation coefficient, or how related these metrics are, based on how journals rank by them. And they basically fall into 2 groups. We have this total citation and eigenfactor that make no adjustment for a journal size. If a journal does well by total citations, it's going to do well by eigenfactor. And then we have all these other metrics that are adjusted for the size of the journal. Basically, no matter which metric you choose, if you've got a journal that's top ranked by one, you're pretty likely to be very highly ranked by another. They're not actually adding very much information to us. We don't really know very much more about what's going on by looking at these different metrics. I kind of just think of it as it's another opportunity for a different journal to claim to be top in that subject. And that's really all it's actually adding to the situation. So, as we all know, the impact factor is not popular. This was the title of an editorial in the Chronicle of Higher Education, the number that's devouring science. In 2013, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, or DORA, was announced. And this has been signed by, this is where I should be able to read my own slides, 381 organisations and 9,300 individuals. Organisations include the Wellcome Trust, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, Cold Harbour Springs Press, eLife, BMJ, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Association for European Anthropologists. So it's quite a mix of people in here that are all saying we shouldn't be using the impact factor to judge research. This is the key point that comes out of the DORA declaration. Their kind of key theme, I think, really is this need to eliminate the use of journal-based metrics in judging scientists' research output. Doesn't give you much information. Just because you happen to be published next to a short history of shallops in Active Crystallography section A, doesn't mean that my article is also going to get 32,000 citations. It's entirely irrelevant to that fact. Simultaneously to this, a few years earlier, Jason Priam and Cameron Naylan and a few other people made this altmetric manifesto, which is saying we should also be looking beyond citations, but again keeping to this idea of the article level metrics. So let's kind of move on and talk a bit about usage and follow into this article level metrics. Now, to me, when we talk about usage, this is what I like to imagine. I like to imagine students reading their research and reading the stuff that we're making an effort to distribute to them, not more like my desk, which is a pile of papers that I've never actually read. Now, usage, I think, is always a misnomer in some ways. It should really be downloads. That's what we're actually measuring when we're talking about it. And this leaves us with some problems. For journals with a large print readership, usage download factors aren't a particularly useful measure for us. They're not telling us about the people who are accessing this via print. They're not telling us about people who are taking it and emailing it to their colleagues because their colleagues don't have decent internet access to be able to download and browse to the actual paper themselves. They're not taking account of people who are reading it in repositories and in grey literature resources. So this usage figure is not quite as accurate and all-encompassing as a lot of us like to think. That said, it is a very valuable metric for us, particularly from a publisher's perspective. We can see what's being downloaded and what's popular in our journals. And we also get an idea of what's going on in areas where the citation profile is much weaker. So social science and humanities research, practitioner research, educational research. These areas get very few citations, and the citations accrue maybe 5 or 10 years after publication. So we get a much quicker idea of what's going on, but we need to be aware of the fact that we're missing a vast amount of information from them. And in terms of article level metrics, these are kind of, again, quite a new tool to us. We couldn't really do article level metrics until things like Web of Science and Scopus were widely available, because there's no way I want to go and sit through bound copies of the Science Citation Index and count up how many citations my work's got. It's not a good use of my time. I can now go and stick it into Web of Science and see that I've got no citations. And they deal with the discrepancies that come out of the journal impact factor. Instead of looking at the value of my work based on the container in which it's being published, I can make a value judgment based on how it's being used by the community. I can see how many people have downloaded it. I can see how many citations it's received. There is, however, a slight trade-off here, because these are all backwards-looking metrics. I can't say, I published my paper yesterday, here's how many citations it's got. It won't receive any for at least another 6, 12, 18 months. So there's a paper that was published in PLOS Biology on the 6th of October, which I vaguely read, and also one published by the economic assessment part of the REF, looking and saying that, well, actually, impact factors still do have a value at the article level, but it's only for very newly published research. If I publish my article today, the impact factor is a reasonable approximation of how many citations my paper is going to receive in the next 2 years. So in order to make a judgment about the cited potential of my research, the impact factor is as good a value as I've got to be able to make a judgment about that. So it still has a place, and it's still useful for judging kind of academic research in terms of journals and from a kind of librarian's perspective rather than a journal's perspective, an article's perspective. I'm going to skip my stuff on the H-index because I'm already behind. I'm just going to highlight that I think TNF isn't unique in doing this. Lots of publishers have article-level metrics on their platforms, and they're starting to become much more widely used. And I'm going to talk about alt metrics. So when I talk about alt metrics, people often think what I'm really talking about is social media, mentioned Twitter, Facebook. But I think there's a large demand within the alt metrics community to move more widely in this and to start looking at how we can pull in information from things like working papers, output from organisations like the NIH, the World Bank, from the MIF, and say, well, how can we trace this back to scientific research and scientific output? And this is giving us a kind of a different viewpoint, again, to how we can understand what's going on around our research, more than just the citation perspective. The other aspect of alt metrics is this idea of a filter. There were 1.7 million articles published in 2012 that were indexed in Scopus. No one can read this quantity of research, and even in quite niche fields, no one can read all the research that's being published. So the big selling point from alt metrics is that I can say these are very quick, very fast. Most articles get most of their mentions in social media very quickly. So if 20 people who I follow on Twitter have all said this article's amazing, I probably should spend my time to go and read it. It's an extra tool to help me filter my research and to filter what I want to read. And it comes also into this aspect of what I'm going to call my metaphor for research flavours. And there are many different types of research, and we can't use the same metric for all of them. I think that's always has to be the key point when we're looking at these type of things. So alt metrics is there to kind of help expand our idea of what impact looks at, and what impact is and what's measurable. There's no point in just taking citations, particularly if we're talking about educational research. It's not going to help us. Or download figures for an area where most of this content is being delivered in print or read in print still. It's, again, not going to help us. So we want to be hunting for new metrics and new methodologies to be able to understand what's going on. And again, I'm going to skip through that because I'm a bit behind. So you might recognise this as Sai, or the video Gangnam Style was the first video on YouTube to get more than 1 billion views. This is the kind of outstanding question with the altmetric data. Is the content that gets good altmetric scores just the things that's fashionable and trendy? I don't think anyone's going to stand up and say that Gangnam Style is the best video that's ever been put on YouTube. So are these tools only going to find us the things that are popular and fashionable and easy, not the things that are necessarily giving us the best science? And I think this is an area where these tools still need to make an argument for it, and how we can utilise them and how we can understand the scores that we're getting. These are very new. The altmetrics donut that was created by people at Nature, it's only been around for 18 months now. We still don't really have a decent understanding of what the scores mean. They are also subject dependent, as you might expect. This is for Taylor and Francis journals. Our behavioural science journals do much better. This is the things that interest people. They want to know about human behaviour, so they go and tweet about it, they Facebook about it, it gets picked up in the newspapers, the BBC, the Guardian. So the kind of bit that I wanted to try and pull back together, specifically for this audience, which is why I've rushed through everything else so much, is this idea of south and north. So we basically have a lot of metrics that were designed in the global north that people are trying to implement into the global south. So we have the impact factor, we have the source and the SNP values. So starting off with citations, there's a couple of issues. So I had a look in Web of Science, and there were 2,055 papers by Nigerian authors published in 2012 in Web of Science. There were 4,736 in Scopus. From the age-old survey, there were 99 journals from Nigeria. In 4 of them have an impact factor. 17 of them are in Scopus. We're not measuring most of the research that's coming out of Africa. If we're using citation metrics based on these tools, then we're not going to be accounting for the research that's coming out. We're not going to be giving it a fair weighting. If we think we're indexing 40% of the research in the UK, then always that research is going to do better in terms of impact factors and citations because the community that's engaging with it is being counted. Cielo has been integrated into Web of Knowledge, which is Brazilian and now South African as well. But these citation counts don't integrate into the impact factor. They're completely separate. And in fact, just having your journal in Cielo, it will now be returnable in Web of Knowledge, and its citation counts will partly appear. But it doesn't give you an impact factor, and it doesn't engage with the rest of the impact factor citation universe. So these things are kind of independent. We know that Research for Life and INASP are working very hard to push accessibility for content and usage of content into the global south. But we still face issues with this, and we still know that bandwidth challenges are still causing problems, and that the usage figures we get are not going to be entirely representative of how people are actually engaging with that content. In terms of altmetrics, this map that I've turned upside down is a map of Facebook connections. So that someone has taken a pair of friends in 2 different cities and put a little line between them in white. Africa, in the middle, is mostly dark, particularly compared to the kind of northern United States and northern Europe. Again, Russia is not big on Facebook. You can't use Facebook in China. Facebook is blocked in Iran. If we're using social media to measure research output and in some way making a value judgment about it, these measures that are basically designed by people sitting in London, New York, and Stanford, using tools that were developed in California, are not necessarily going to translate well into different research, into different areas. We can't take tools from and just assume that they're going to sit safely and be usable for us. So I kind of came up with this framework, which is still very much a work in progress, and it will need to be changed considerably, I think. Of this looking at the ease of how easy it is to measure something and what value that actually gives us. So we have things like downloads, citations, tweets, patents that we use a lot because they're very, very easy and quick to measure. We can go onto Web of Science and I can put out my citation counts very quickly. I can go into an online usage platform and put out how many downloads a paper has got. What that downloads figure doesn't actually tell me is actually how many people are reading this. I'm completely separated from my print readership, I'm completely separated from my kind of social sharing that's going on via email, and I'm completely separated from the people who, conversely, have downloaded it and never read it. So we have those 2 factors. Our citations, we know, are missing a vast amount of the research in the world. There's between 30,000 and 100,000 journals in the world, depending on who you read and which source you want to take. So of that, 10,000 are indexed in Web of Science, 11,000 in Web of Science, 20,000 in Scopus. We're still missing a vast amount of the research and all the citations. That's before we started to look at books, conferences, grey literature, all this other material that's engaging with academic research, but we're not including in our citation metrics. So they may be very easy to use, and they may give us some value, but they don't really give us that much information. We also want to be in some way looking down at the bottom, things like teaching resources. If someone is using my research to teach, that's probably actually a much more active use of my research than some random person citing it 5 years after I've published it. How can we engage with that? How can we understand it? And the same with people using it to make legislation, make press coverage, a wider understanding of my research. So we have all these areas that really, this is the kind of eventual goal of the altmetrics movement, and that's the things they want to try and understand. How they're going to get there, I think, is a completely different matter. And also we have this kind of area in the bottom right. These are really difficult things to measure in some regards, and of really high value. What we want to understand in some ways is this drug, this treatment, is linked back to this research, or this application of this treatment in this geographical area or cultural area is linked back to this research. Now I might be able to say that this paper here was the key paper for this drug, but what I can't easily do is say that these were the 20 other papers that they depended on to do it, and that these are the next 30 papers that tell me how I can actually use this drug in this environment. So this kind of area down the bottom, which is very difficult to measure and high value to measure, is where we want to be going towards. How we're going to get there is, I think, a completely different matter. And there we go. And I think, coming on to questions. Yeah, perfect timing.